Hello everybody, my name is Shortline819 and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program, and I've decided to capitalize on the success of that last video by making another and showing off the improved Odysseus 1 somewhat fully reusable launch vehicle, and actually, well, doing something with it, and that thing is of course a lunar mission. Now, this is not the way you design mission architecture. Typically, the way you do it is you determine what your requirements are and then you build a launch vehicle around that. This is not the case. Obviously, I built this launch vehicle first and then decided what to do with it, but hey, it still mostly works. But the Odysseus 1 has seen several improvements in order to get it working in a working state that I'm happy with. There's several improvements with both the first stage and the reusable engine pod. The main improvement is that in order to get the payload capacity to orbit that I wanted, I stretched the booster on both the first and second stage, which doesn't always work, but it did work in this case, and well, hey, Starship is doing that, so why can't I? There's also several improvements with the first stage, as you can see here. The main thing being, well, obviously it's stretched, so that I have a little bit extra margin when heading back to the Kerbal Space Center. And I also fixed the grid fins. Last time around, with the previous version in the previous video, I had 2 grid fins, now I have 4, and in the last video they were also upside down, so they didn't work. It's like, oh, why aren't these working? Well, they're upside down, and many people pointed that out in the comments. And yeah, so this allows us to fly back, do a boost back burn to the Kerbal Space Center and land, and I've gotten pretty good at this. I still mostly just send it on a ballistic trajectory, even though I probably could somewhat steer it with those grid fins. I don't exactly have that technique down. We still do a re-entry burn, as you can see, despite the fact that we have those grid fins, which do help us slow down. Now, in this instance, I was actually coming back fairly close to one of those landing pads there that's a part of the KSC extended mod. I was thinking, maybe I'll have enough fuel to land, but I realized I'm not experienced enough to actually maneuver this around in any significant way, so I mostly just set it down next to the landing pad. You could count that as on the landing pad, but anyways, going back to the upper stage in our payload, our lunar mission, the mission architecture I have for this is a Earth orbit, or I guess Kerbin orbit, rendezvous style mission architecture, where you have a space tug and then you have a lander / return capsule that launches on a second rocket, meets up with the space tug, and then goes out to the moon. This is the Hadar space tug, Hadar being the Arabic word for Agena, Agena of course being the Agena target vehicle, which wasn't powered by hydrogen, but hey, it's a space tug nonetheless, and it has powered by hydrogen, has a lot of delta V by itself. It has 6,000 meters a second of delta V, which is when we dock the lander to it, obviously that will go down, but it's still sufficient enough to send the lander out to the moon and back. And we also have the upper stage as well, and we disconnect that. We send the deploy out the Hadar with the solar panels so that the tanks can be kept cool and all that cool stuff. And I get it into a circular orbit, which I'm not entirely sure why I did that, because with the lander, when I begin to talk more about the lander, I had some severe mass restrictions with that because it was on the upper limit of what the Odysseus can actually throw into low Kerbin orbit. So as a part of the cutting of the mass, I had to remove the RCS off of that. So this is the only thing with the RCS. So this is what's going to be docking with the lander, the Pathfinder lander, once we send that into orbit, just about now actually. And this is our launch vehicle for the Pathfinder lander, Odysseus 1, with a really weird, almost bulbous fairing. You got 4 Kerbals, of course, the classic quadro, is that a word, of Jeb, Bill, Bob, and Val. Launching up, and this lander is somewhat based off of the 1992 First Lunar Outpost Study lander. It's a 2-stage lander, a descent stage and the ascent stage, and the ascent stage takes you directly back to Kerbin, and then docks with the Hadar on the bottom, and docks. So there's the engine, and then there's a docking port below that where they dock to. And fairly decent trajectory. I typically launch these on a bit of a lofted trajectory, simply because I don't want the first stage to be too far downrange from the Kerbal Space Center once it gets back. Now there were many people in the last video on the comments who pointed out that I wasn't doing the reentry, the actual flying back of the booster to the Space Center right. I would wait until I was at my apoapsis, and then I'd turn back and be like, oh yeah, maybe that saves fuel, at least in my mind. But no, it doesn't save fuel. It actually wastes fuel, so that adds a little bit more extra performance. And of course, I've started to go ahead and do the boost back burn right away, like what Falcon 9 does when it does RTLS, what Neutron will do. Not New Glenn, because New Glenn isn't doing land landings, but seen this before. Fairly routine landing at this point. Of course, it never gets old for me flying it. Of course, watching it in real life, it does get rather old, because I remember the early Falcon 9 landing attempts where everything, you weren't quite sure if it would land or, if it would make the re-entry, and every launch was an event. Now there's like, oh, there's 2 Starlink launches yesterday, who cares? So I'm coming back, and this landing, I kind of botched it ever so slightly. As you can see, I come in a bit rough down near the beach, like in the previous video, and then I basically cut all my velocity, and I hover at that point, and then I slowly begin to go down. At this point, okay, I got this landing in the bag, plenty of delta V left, and then I touch down and promptly Jason 3 myself and crash over. Nothing blows up except for the one landing gear, so hey, maybe that's reusable. I just need a little bit extra practice in that regard. We return back to the Odysseus upper stage and the Pathfinder lander, and I go ahead and begin to throttle back and deploy the fairing. There it is, the 4-person capsule and the ascent stage and the descent stage, also powered by hydrogen, simply because it's a really efficient fuel, especially in Kerbal Space Program with the cryofuels mod. A lot of people also asked for the mod list. I did post some of the mods, but hopefully, probably not when this is uploaded, but probably shortly after, I will put together a mod list for everyone in the comments, because people seem to be interested in the mod list that I use. I've gotten pretty good at getting these things into orbit. Of course, that's aided by the fact that I have more margin now. I remember in the previous video, I was able to make orbital velocity, but not an actual stable orbit in and of itself. That has no longer really a problem. I briefly go back to the tracking station because in order to make the Odysseus look cool, I have a whole bunch of decals, including on the upper stage engine pod for the thermal blankets and the TPS. However, there is a glitch with conformal decals where some of the decals, if you cross, you might have noticed it, but if you cross an atmospheric boundary, they sometimes just disappear. And typically that's fixed by just reloading. Go ahead, deploy the lander. The lander is going to be waiting for us. No RCS as a part of the mass saving measures in order to get this into orbit. I do have the solar panels, of course, to keep the cryogenic fuel cool. And then we go ahead and we switch back to the Hadar, and now it's just the matter of executing a pretty standard rendezvous. This rendezvous was somewhat time sensitive because, as it turns out, the Pathfinder lander, the solar panels on that aren't actually enough to keep all of the fuel cool, so it will slowly run out of electrical charge. And when it runs out of electrical charge, the fuel will begin to leak out because the coolers and the fuel tanks will shut off. Fairly simple rendezvous. It's just a matter of getting them fairly close to one another. And of course, these craft are small and nimble, so it's just once you get them close to one another, you just point the docking ports at one another and slowly line up and just dock them together. It's not a situation where you have a big space station where you actually need to do maneuvers or have one payload that's really massive and one payload that's really small, and that's not really feasible. So yeah, pretty standard docking here. Of course, over the night, because, it wouldn't be a Kerbal Space Program docking if it didn't happen at night. But hey, that's what the lights are for. I don't think I have them. Do I have them on in the video? But it's kind of hard to see in the in the video. But we got a docking, and oh yeah, we do have the lights on, the port and starboard lights that I always like to have on. My editing software is being a bit funky, but anyways, we go ahead. And at this point, we still have those 2 Odysseus upper stages in orbit. Now, I say it's somewhat fully reusable because there are some portions of the launch vehicle that are expendable, like the fairings, obviously, but you can't reuse those, and there is a stacked decoupler that gets jettisoned. But the upper stage tanks, they're not designed to come back. What they're supposed to sort of emulate is ideas they had during the early shuttle program with the external tank, where they would reuse them on orbit as like a space station or a fuel depot. So that's why I still classify it as fully reusable, because the tanks are meant to be reused on orbit. They have their own docking ports, their own RCS. It's just a matter of docking these two together, forming the start of what hopefully is a larger fuel depot or a space station. It's cool to see them dock together on orbit, but we're going to be leaving one of the Odysseus upper stage engine pods on orbit to act as a service module. The other we're going to be sending back down. And I've also made a couple of improvements to this, most notably fins. I've also shifted some of the parachutes and some of the solar panels more towards the front, so the center of mass is towards the front. You've got to balance out the engine in the back. But even then, that wasn't working. It was still flipping over like in the last video, so I actually sneaked two of the radial ore tanks together in the front fuel tank to prevent it from flipping out upon reentry, and that mostly works. You still need the RCS, you still need the SAS to kind of keep it straight to make sure it doesn't become aerodynamically unstable and flip out. And it's not a perfect system. Once it gets deeper into the atmosphere, it does actually begin to become aerodynamically unstable and flip out. As you can see right here. That's not me touching the keyboard, that's just it doing by itself. Deploy out the drogues, which when you deploy out the drogues, turns out that this does actually have a little bit of lift to it. It's not enough to actually, go anywhere significant. The cross range is tiny, but hey, it's enough. And drogues cut, mains deploy, and it's just a matter of it floating back down to the ocean so that the recovery team can come and pick it up and it can be So I went to go have dinner, and then I came back, just like this recording session, and I load into the game, and I noticed something a bit strange, which is the Pathfinder lander and the Odysseus 1 launch vehicle are still on the pad, and the Hadar is still in orbit just by itself, and I'm like, oh gosh, I guess it didn't save before. So I guess the game crashed before it could save the game data file. So I get a bit frustrated. I'm like, okay, am I going to have to do that rendezvous and that docking and that reentry all over again? I'm like, nah, I'm too lazy. I want to get the video out. So I do what every good Kerbal Space Program player does and cheat. I basically just go into the vehicle assembly building, put the Pathfinder on top of the Hadar, adjust the fuel levels so it would be somewhat close to what it was, and then I just cheat them on orbit. As you can see here, the good old debug menu. So I just cheat them on orbit, get everything deployed again, and I get ready for the actual the lunar mission, the translunar injection, sending us out beyond low Kerbin orbit, out to the Mun. And I go ahead and I do the classic thing of you just warp until you see the Mun come over the horizon, and then you just go ahead and you burn your TLI. And yeah, fairly simple, other than the actual Earth orbit rendezvous and reusability aspect. This is a fairly simple lunar mission, flags and footprints, go there, plant a flag, get the Kerbals out, take some screenshots, come back. Maybe in the future I'll do more complicated missions with this reusable launch vehicle, but I just wanted to see if I could do something like this right now, which turns out, yes, I can. And in putting together this mission, this entire mission architecture, I've begun to realize that, yeah, with reusable launch vehicles, you get a massive weight penalty. Like the best example in real life is the space shuttle, right? The space shuttle orbiter is it's a 100-ton orbiter, but you can only lift 25 tons in the payload bay with it. And like Starship is another one. Obviously, they're trying to stretch the booster just to match their original payload to orbit targets. So pretty standard TLI. And for this, because the lander was mass constrained, it doesn't have a lot of spare delta V, especially in the descent stage. It's technically double of what is strictly needed, but even then it's like, okay, you want to have at least a little bit of margin. So as a result of that, in order to have the most efficient landing possible, we come in very low over the moon, get ourselves into a sub 30 kilometer orbit. I also generally like to orbit low around the moon anyways, because, well, it's really fun to watch the surface go by. One of my favorite things to do is I always like to put like a tiny little probe in like the lowest orbit possible and just watch everything just slide beneath you. But yeah, Hadar is doing its job. It's able to get this into a low lunar orbit, or lunar. I keep going back and forth, with plenty of fuel left for it to go back to low Kerbin orbit and potentially be reused there. So we get into our initial parking orbit, warp over until the daylight so I can execute a smaller burn, and then we go ahead and we uncouple that docking port 2, deploy the landing gear, and then what we do is we warp around a little bit because I want to land at near the bottom of that crater, because I believe the Neil Armstrong Memorial is over there. Of course, spoiler alert, I don't actually end up seeing it or finding it. But we unlock the fuel tanks and begin our descent to the Munar surface. Of course, is a little bit tight delta V wise, not too much to actually maneuver, and this is where I actually began to panic slightly a bit here, because I overshot the suicide burn. Take some screenshots there. I overshot the suicide burn countdown for flight engineer, for Kerbal Engineer, and I panicked for a second, be like, oh gosh, am I actually going to be able to slow down in time? Am I going to form a new crater on the surface, and is Jeb, Bill, Bob, and Val going to be dead? Turns out, no, it's not all that big of a deal. What ends up happening is I bleed off enough velocity in time, craft gets lighter, TWR goes up, and I'm able to successfully put myself down on the moon, or whatever you want to call it, not Minmus, the gray one. That could refer to a lot of other places. It could refer to, it's not Ike. But we land and we begin to slide. I'm like, okay, when something like this normally happens, it'll slide a little bit, and then it'll eventually just stop. And so here's me looking to see if I could spot the Neil Armstrong Memorial, but no. So I go ahead, and of course I get Jeb out, deploy the ladders. Of course, this has a little porch, just like the first lunar access lander would actually have, and something like Altair would have it as well. Starship has an elevator. And I go ahead and I get Jeb out, walking around the moon, celebrates with a jump, and then what we do is we go ahead and, of course, plant the stars and stripes on the surface of the moon while our lander continues to slide in the background. Jeb doesn't seem very concerned about it, though. I do try and get the lander to stop sliding. I try and deploy and undeploy some landing gear in order to make it stop sliding, and I eventually determine that, hey, maybe I should actually move it over to flat ground. So I light up the engines, almost tip over and die, and then I fly it over to some flat ground, and I almost tip over and die here again. So they're very lucky that I was actually able to put this down on the surface in time, or without tipping it over, and then I have to send a rescue mission, of course, and don't want to do that. Fly Jeb over to the lander, and of course at this point you got to get everybody out. What's the purpose of coming to the moon if you don't get everybody out and take a picture or two? Simple flags and footprints sort of deal. They've come here to do what they've set out to do. What does that sentence mean? I don't know. And then I go ahead, and now it's simply time to go home, damaging the descent stage a significant amount in the process. Of course, the descent stage, even with the Apollo lunar modules in real life, the descent stage was used as a launch pad for the ascent stage. So hopefully when we go and find an Apollo descent stage on the surface of the moon, hopefully in a few years or so, those will probably be somewhat damaged. At this point, the mission architecture is fairly simple. No complicated rendezvous in low lunar orbit, no transferring to command module, just get into an orbit, point and burn, head back home. And yes, I'm actually quite happy with how all of this how all of this has turned out, both the launch vehicle and the actual lander, the whole lunar mission itself, which, although that being said, I do want to improve on this launch vehicle in the future. I kind of want to make a bigger one so I can do lift bigger payloads, do more complicated missions, and hey, maybe that'll be in future videos. Fairly simple reentry at this point. Of course, Kerbal Space Program's reentry is fairly weak, so I did half the ablator on that to save weight. Coming down in the mountains, of course, well, near the mountains, or maybe even the Badlands, I don't know. Deploy main, deploy drogue, and it's just a matter of touching down and having the recovery crews come out and get them. So thank you all for watching. I was astounded by the views I got on the last video. It has almost 6K views, and as you can see now, the descent stage has taken a bit of damage, but hey, it doesn't matter at this point. But yeah, stay tuned for more Kerbal Space Program videos, and yeah, thank you so much, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye, everybody.